Hello, everyone. It seems most people are already joined in this session, so I would like to welcome you to this breakout session with Melanie Herget's talk. She's working at the Thünen Institute for Rural Mobility and Areas, and soon she will be in the University of Kassel, and we are very happy that she will talk today to us. She actually made her PhD thesis about the topic of gender and mobility, and yes, we are very happy that you're here, Melanie. I would like to give you the screen, or can you already share?
Yes, thank you very much, Elias. I will share the screen. Yes, so dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I'm very pleased to be invited to give you some food for thought on why does gender matter in rural mobility. Before I start with the research on this topic, let's take a quick look at some central definitions. First of all, what exactly is rural? In Germany, this is a very general term, and very often it is not neutrally used, but it's used as the remaining residual areas that are kind of left over when you take away the vibrant cities and suburban areas. Also, there are several definitions for rural. The BBSR, for instance, distinguishes between 4 types of areas, 2 of them being rural. According to this typology, 32% of all Germans live in rural areas, and this covers 69% of the total area. But my colleague, Patrick Küpper, on the other hand, he stated that rurality is not a clear type of area, but a spectrum, a continuum. And the rural character is all the more pronounced the lower the settlement density, the lower the population potential, and the worse the accessibility of large centers, and so on. And according to this different typology, 57% of all Germans live in rural areas, and this covers 91% of the total area. So why do I tell you this? Well, depending on the respective definition, rural areas are a topic of a majority or a minority. They are important or rather negligible. So please look carefully at the definitions and the spatial definitions that are used. So what is gender? Gender is often used and often defined in contrast to sex. The term sex usually distinguishes between male or female and refers to biological features, while the term gender, on the contrary, usually describes a spectrum between masculinity and femininity and refers to culture and socialization processes. Now, in transport behavior research, we very often only have the binary variable sex to work with. But when you look closer at the differences between male and female persons, in circumstances as similar as possible, the explanations mainly refer to gender aspects. But why does gender matter in rural areas? Well, first of all, In Germany, the family work is still mainly undertaken by females, no matter if they live in rural or urban areas. And in addition to that, we still find different gender arrangements and family cultures between East and West Germany, which have their origin in quite different family politics during the German separation. Also, many rural areas in East and West Germany nowadays have a high proportion of elderly female persons with mobility restrictions and without a driving license. So we have to keep in mind that the mobility problems of demographic change are neither neutral to spatial types nor to gender. And finally, there's a fourth important reason why gender matters in rural areas, and that is selective out-migration. Namely, after the German reunification in rural East Germany, mainly young and well-educated women migrated to West Germany. So, what do we know about rural mobility and what does it have to do with gender? When you look at the mobility resources of households, you'll see that rural households often own more than one car and rarely no car. They rarely own a public transport subscription and they are rarely car sharing members. All of this applies to men and women nearly equally, but it also depends highly on economic status. And gender research shows that there's a gender pay gap, meaning that within partnerships, within the same age groups, and even within the same branch of industry and the same amount and type of work, women earn less money than men. In addition to that, we have cohort effects. For instance, when you look at the car availability of young adults, you'll barely find any differences between men and women. But when you look at the car availability of people aged 65 plus years, you'll see that there's increase of car availability between 2002 and 2017, indicated by a decreasing percentage of people with no car, dark blue, and an increasing percentage of people with one or more cars. No car was great. And this increase is much higher for women than for men. Although in total, the car availability of women aged 65 plus years today is still lower than that for men. You can find a similar phenomenon when you look at the possession of a driving license of men and women in different age groups. The biggest increase takes place in age groups of 60 years and older. And the increase itself is bigger for men than for women than for men, but starting at a much lower level. You compare the yellow and red lines with the blue lines. But transport behavior research not only looks at resources, but also at how much do people travel, how do people travel, and why do people travel the way they do. And it's also interesting to look at gender aspects in these questions. First of all, in rural areas, people take longer trips, there's more car use and more monomodal car users than in urban areas. And depending on the spatial typology you use, the differences in the use of transport modes between urban and rural inhabitants are lower or higher, but the direction always stays the same. So you can find more car use in rural areas compared to urban or metropolitan areas, as shown here. And yeah, this is the same analysis for full-time employees and the differences between male and female users. And yeah, you can see that the differences is higher in metropolitan areas. It's important to keep in mind that modal choice is neither entirely rational nor completely irrational. One rational aspect of the high car use in rural areas is shown by the comparison of travel times by car versus public transport. As this diagram shows, in rural areas, there's a much higher share of trips that would take 30 minutes more or even longer if you theoretically had used public transport instead of the car. Another rational aspect of the higher car use is shown by a look at the trip length. In small towns and rural areas, there's a much higher share of long trips of 10 kilometers and more, and a lower share of short trips under 5 kilometers. Plus, around 40% of all adults combine activities, which is also called trip chaining. And then, even if you have only short distances of 1 kilometer or 2, as soon as one of the sections is valued as dangerous or complicated, you'll take the car instead of the bike. So the most dangerous or complicated section determines modal choice. Now, when you look at the daily distances traveled in different age groups, you'll see that the main differences occur between men and women aged 30 to 70 years. In these age groups, women travel much shorter distances than men. On the other hand, when you look at the number of trips made by adults in rural regions, you'll see that only in households with children, there's a significant difference between men and women, with the women making more trips than men. This phenomenon can be explained by the typical mobility patterns of adults. If you don't have to do family work, your main trips are going to work, maybe do some shopping on the way home, and maybe doing some leisure activities in the evening. But if you have to do family work, you'll have to do additional escort trips. For instance, on your way to work, you may have to escort your first child to school and your second child to kindergarten. And in the afternoon, you may take your 2 children to their leisure activities. And in the evening, sometimes you'll have to leave again for a parent-teacher conference. Oddly enough, often defined as a leisure activity in transport behavior research. And you can find these patterns easily when you look at trip purposes. Again, some graphics on that. In young adults' households, the main differences between men and women are the vocational trips, with men making more vocational trips than women. And you can find this difference in metropolitan areas on the left as well as in rural areas. But only in rural areas, young women tend to make more shopping trips than their male counterparts. Now, if you look at the trip purposes of adults in family households, you'll instantly see big differences between men and women. Again, with women making fewer vocational trips, but also with less commuting trips and a much higher share of escort trips. This can be explained by the role-typical division of labor in families. This role-typical division of labor also depends on the scope of work of women. So in family households where both partners work full-time, the differences are obviously smaller. And this is not only the case for trip purposes, but also for modal choice as shown here. Well, in addition to the use of trip diaries, there are also other methodological approaches, like the analysis of time-space path of all members of a multi-person household. Here's an example for such a time-space diagram of a rural family household. Each household member has an own colored line, and the hours of the day are on the x-axis, while on the y-axis you can see the respective distance from home. Thorsten Hägerstrand was the first one who focused on such time-space path. And he stated that one's individual time-space path is often formed by other people. Consequently, he defined the term coupling constraints as the limits that are caused by the needs of other people and resulting in the formation of bundles in such diagrams. You can see examples for such bundles between the mother and daughter 2 at 3 p.m. and between the son and daughter 1 at 5:30 p.m. Now, if you have several of these time-space diagrams, you can analyze their similarities and differences. And this is what I did some years ago during my PhD project on mobility patterns of rural families. There I derived 24 time-space diagrams based on interviews. And in most of these diagrams, you could find a coupling of the mother and at least one child. And the father had longer trips than the mother, all together and resulting in what I called role-typical trip patterns. Besides, there were also what I called unilaterally modernized trip patterns, with the mother having similarly long trips than the father, or even longer, but still being the only one with a coupling. In some East German families, I also found independent trip patterns of parents and their children with no coupling at all. And a few family households also were described as role reversal trip patterns, with the mother having similarly long or longer trips and a coupling between the father and the children. So what are my conclusions from what I showed to you? First of all, for truly gender-sensitive transport behavior research, we still need different kinds of surveys. Surveys with a third gender, for instance, and with variables on household composition, division of labor, trip chaining, trips that were not made, and a subjective rating of trips and places according to the personal feeling of safety. In addition to that, we also need different kinds of data collection and evaluation, as it is especially important to compare sex groups only within similar living conditions. It is also helpful to do some in-depth analysis of the variance within sex groups and to include qualitative approaches for motives, coupling constraints, and similar things. Finally, we also need different kinds of research environments, which means, for instance, we need to support academics with their childcare and elderly care, and we need to enable leadership positions in part-time. And in order to achieve a more gender-oriented transport planning, we have to keep in mind the short distances. We need to plan for compact and mixed-use residential quarters and for a decentralized supply infrastructure. We need to enhance the quality of stay, play, and meet in public spaces and minimize places that give rise to fear. And last but not least, the concept of gender mainstreaming means to plan for and with different social groups. And this implies a gender impact assessment of plans, processes, and committees, and appropriate job and participation offerings for different living conditions. Obviously, this is not an easy task, and there's still quite a lot to do and to change. But remember, mobility always starts in your head. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this talk. This was very nice. For everyone, if you have questions, you could now get the chance to ask them. You can turn on your mic since we are not so many people. And yes, I hope we have a nice discussion now. No one? Okay, so maybe I will ask a first question, if I may. Seeing that women have less cars in general, do you think they are more likely to use innovative mobility solutions like car sharing or something? Because in e-mobility, I know that women are less likely to use innovative technologies, for example. What do you think could be here the case?
Well, I think it's not that easy to answer that question. Well, because the tendency that women have show less car use has to do with several aspects, and that I talked about earlier, like shorter distances to work very often, and a lot of trip changing if they have children and they try to arrange their life in a nearby area. Well, like you said, as far as I know, when it comes to e-car sharing, it's usually men with a high education and who are likely to use electric car sharing. But this might be because it's a new technology, it is innovative, and these technological first movers are usually rather men than women in our society. Well, the thing is, we don't have like really valid data on car sharing in total in Germany, because you have to distinguish between commercial car sharing or private car sharing. I think in rural areas there's a lot of like private car sharing between neighbors, within family, and you have no data on that. Because like in the studies that I analyzed mobility in Germany, you can only see which transport mode is used, but you can't see who owns the car that is used. And so again, this means that you need to do more qualitative research and to conduct interviews to find out more about this informal car sharing behavior of men and women in rural areas.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have a question?
Hi, I would have a question. Selma Frobel, studying geography, and I'm writing my master thesis at the moment, kind of about mobility in rural areas. And I would be interested if you can recognize already a shift in planning, if there is more acknowledged in gender questions. Is there, a shift to include other perspectives already, or how did you notice?
Well, my impression is that there's definitely a change to to slower modes of transport, like bicycle use and going by bike, which stems from the discussions led mainly in urban areas, and these already mentioned sustainable urban mobility plans. So we have a shift coming from the high distance and the high distance modes of cars versus public transport, paying more attention to the nearby development and nearby slower transport and active transport modes. And this is something that obviously helps all social groups that are not so oriented towards long distances and have these rather complex trip chaining in nearby areas. I would not say that there's a big shift towards gender issues. I mean, as far as well, my impression is that of course there has been a longer debate about gender mainstreaming also in like the processes and the amount of women taking part in committees and processes. But it does not seem to be like a topic of a majority yet. And well, there's still a lot of conferences with all male panels, and what I see is that more and more female academics tend to work together and to implement own networks in order to change that. So I think there's more networking nowadays, but still not really like a broad debate. But yeah, maybe someone has another impression, so I would like to hear your impression too.
Well, since I'm not like in practical work yet, I don't know, I feel like in academics, like in academical questions or scientific questions, it does raise the issue, but I'm not sure if it's in practical planning. I guess it's not yet included. So I would agree, actually, yeah. But maybe someone else can add something from practical work.
Okay, so I'm just looking at the time a bit. We are already a little late, so I would say thank you all for the discussion, and thank you, Melanie, especially for your nice talk. And everyone, I would, of course, like to see you again next week, the 11th September, for our next sessions. And yes, until then, I wish you all a good week and weekend.
Okay.
Thank you.
So have a good day.
Thank you, you too. Bye.
Bye.